Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your March of the Penguins, our daily waddle through my Penguin classics on the back wall there. We're going book by book and era by era. We're doing a very slow version of what would have been a normal shelf tour. Well, I did a shelf tour of this whole room, and I skipped the Penguins because they seemed like a black hole, a black spined hole. What I would ordinarily do on a shelf tour is just pull down one book after another so that we do 12 or 15 in the course of one video. Instead, I'm doing one Penguin at a time for all of 2020, and it's going to take us that long at least, even with sometimes blocks happening. We saw a block of Dante. We saw a block of Chaucer. Even with that, it's still going to take some time, especially since when I get to some blocks, I'm not going to want to do them all in one block. I'm going to want to talk about each individual book. But for right now, we're in the Middle Ages. The long Middle Ages. And we mentioned yesterday with the Song of Roland that the Song of Roland was based on a catastrophic but relatively minor event in Charlemagne's military history, and then sort of metamorphosed over centuries into an epic story about Christians versus Muslims. And the reason why it was able to do that, the reason why there was an audience for that to happen, was because by the time it had metamorphosed into what we know as the Song of Roland and a bunch of other stuff, the Crusades were roiling the whole world, and the whole of the Western world, and that is true for our book today, and it could be true for another 50 books. It won't be, I promise, but it could be. And that's going to get us to a subject that I come up with on this March of the Penguins fairly regularly. The main 2 points that I bring up on the March of the Penguins are the pitiless ratio of the survival of some of these early texts and the vagaries of translation, what the translator is deciding to do. Neither one of those is really an issue today. Today we're talking more about editorial stuff, because today we're dealing with a curated volume. We saw a couple of these in the past, and here's another volume that Penguin Classic made where the editor, in this case the translator, is M.R.B. Shaw, and M.R.B. Shaw probably had a lot to do with the editing here as well. And this is a curated volume about the Crusades. This is the title that they have. It's not a title for either of the works included here. The title is The Chronicles of the Crusades. And here we have Joinville and we have Villehardouin. And these are 2 chroniclers of the Crusades, the 4th Crusade and the 7th Crusade, and they were born a century apart from each other. And they were 2 people among many, many, many others. Many others. As is true in all cases, when there's a massive historical upheaval, an event in the real world, it tends to be reflected enormously in the literature of the world. And that is true with the Crusades. All of the Crusades, each of the Crusades spawned romantic epics, saints' lives, and sober military analyses. And we get the 2 works that are included here are Villehardouin did the conquest of Constantinople, and Joinville did a life of King Louis, and in both cases, you can see why Shaw, if it's Shaw that did the picking or whoever at Penguin picked them, you can see why they would pick them and why they would include them together, even though they're not about the same crusade and take place in radically different times. And the reason why is because both the authors were direct eyewitnesses and are very good, sober writers. And that's important. Joinville was a friend of St. Louis. He was a personal friend. Stayed with him, knew him well. It wasn't word of mouth to write about him, to write about his life and the things that were on his mind, his motivations and whatnot. And the same thing is true with Villehardouin, who knew the crusade that he was writing about with intimate detail. He had been a part of it, and he was also wealthy and influential in his province back in France, and knew lots of people who could give him access to primary documents, all that sort of stuff. And none of that would matter if he weren't the right kind of writer, but he was a historian. cared about getting things down exactly right. Now, neither one of these people, neither one of these people, you know, partakes of what we consider today to be history or biography. In this case, it's history and biography. And neither one of them, both of them were writing impassioned personal accounts that were trying to be objective. They were trying to be trustworthy, but they have stake in the matter in a way that would be frowned upon or instructed out of a historian writing today, a professional historian writing today. And the resulting works are fascinating. And I'm definitely recommending the Chronicles of the Crusades as a Penguin Classic volume. I think I set aside. I set aside a passage from Vihardouin. Vihardouin? my French is a little rusty. But this is from the Conquest of Constantinople, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Alas, how ill-advised they both were, two commanders here, and how very wrong it was on the part of those who had caused this breach between them. For if God had not taken pity on them both, they would have lost all the conquests they had made, and Christendom itself would have been exposed to danger. Thus, by an unlucky chance and by unwise counsel, the Emperor and the Marquis were driven to part company. And you see what I mean? I don't want to go on at great length with this author. I'm not all that fond of either of these works, but it's that kind of fervid, melodramatic, you are there type of exigency that runs throughout his work, and it's not entirely a thing of the Middle Ages, because you can go as far as Thomas Carlyle writing about the French Revolution and get the same thing. You can find all sorts of historians running throughout the 19th century, but the 19th century is when those attitudes started to change. And now, the people who call themselves historians and write like this, obviously having an ideological dog in the fight, obviously tarting this stuff up with purple prose to appeal to a reader who is not willing to sit down with a sober work of history. Now, writers like that are the Bill O'Reilly school of supermarket history, the type of thing that it would be an embarrassing blunder for you to cite it, for instance, in a paper or an article of your own. It'd be an embarrassing blunder for you to admit that you read it, and it would be a criminal mistake for you to trust it. As far as I can tell, I'm no expert when it comes to the Crusades. As I've mentioned on this channel before, for some reason, this period just doesn't do it for me. And never has. Even though I've read some wonderful books on the subject, it just doesn't do it for me. And I'm no expert on the period, therefore, and yet I get the feeling that these two authors are fairly reliable. That it's probably a little bit unjust to lump them in with with a charlatan like Bill O'Reilly and his co-writer. But I think you see what I mean. It's a different kind of attitude towards writing history that was born in the early 19th century and now rules the horizon. It rules the whole discipline. So you can't, typically speaking, you can't write like that. You can write fantastic, gripping prose, but not quite so breathless. And both of these writers are a little breathless. So I love the idea of this volume. I'm a big fan of when Penguin Classics curates volumes, when they pick and choose and have a rationale behind what they're doing. And that's clearly true here, because these two works are not only very similar to each other in terms of philosophy of execution, but they're very different from a ton of literature that was spawned by all of the Crusades, or each individual crusade. And that shows the organizing idea. That shows you that someone was awake at the steering wheel at Penguin, as you would know. You wouldn't doubt that would be true. But it also points a finger at something that I think is missing, and that maybe is the reason why this whole period has never done it for me. Maybe the reason why is because I have never been roused to deep, passionate interest by a Penguin classic. It could be. I found faults for me as a reader in Dorothy Sayers' translation of The Song of Roland, and I don't fault the translation of these works here, but they are only 2 out of a sea of works. What I would really like, which is another thing that I do on this March of the Penguins, where I talk about Penguin Classic volumes that don't exist, what I would really like is a big, ornate, 1,000-page Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition that's still called Chronicles of the Crusades, but that has a lot more in it than just these 2 works. Definitely include these 2, but a lot more. And with a lot more in the way of critical apparatus, introduction, and notes and whatnot. A combination, maybe, of this kind of Penguin Classic editorial vision and a bigger work, like the big Oxford Illustrated History of the Crusades, or Christopher Tynemann's The World of the Crusades, books that are helping reluctant interests such as my own to pull them in. I've never seen that in an anthology of Crusade writing. The closest that I have ever come, I've read every major release on the Crusades. I read in an attempt. I know this is a big lacuna. I know that I should like this. I'd be interested more in it than I am. The closest that I've ever come is a work of pseudo-history by Evan S. Connell called Deus Lo Vult, which is terrific, but it's a very strange, quasi-fictitious creation of Evan S. Connell, born, I believe, from his own lack of finding that particular thing. You look for that particular anchoring work to get you into a time period, and for the Crusades, I have never found it. I've read all the popular histories, and just nothing has worked for me. The characters don't stand out. The action doesn't stand out. The whole thing seems sordid from beginning to end. And none of that is true in Deus Lo Vult. Deus Lo Vult is, I mean, in Connell's great work, Son of the Morning Star, which is about the Battle of Little Bighorn, he follows a whorl, a spiral. His narrative forms a spiral that is constantly orbiting around the Battle of Little Bighorn and eventually getting you to the event itself. It's an incredibly convincing, dramatic performance. And Deus Lo Vult is the same way, in a way that I have never encountered in these primary texts. So you might think it'd be a little odd that I'd be sitting here asking essentially for more. But I'm thinking maybe more would do it. Maybe if there were a gigantic Penguin volume called Chronicles of the Crusades, but featuring more than just these 2 keyholes, maybe that would have done it for me. I'd like to think that my time with the Crusades is not over. I'd like to think that something will do it for me down the line. But Deus Lo Vult mainly made me want to go back to the writings of Evan S. Connell, not go back to the Crusades. So I don't know what that will be. So I'm in the odd position here in terms of winding up the video with a recommendation. These 2 works are incredibly important. First of all, we couldn't know the Crusades or St. Louis anything like the way we do now without them. And the translation here is good. The action never flags in either one of these books, either one of the works included in here. So I can recommend it. I definitely can recommend it. It just didn't do it for me. It certainly didn't do it for me. I go back to this, especially when there is a new book on the Crusades and I need to brush up on everything in order to write about it or even to read it critically, but not with love. Not with the kind of love that I like to have for Penguin Classics. So it's a recommendation, and certainly a strong one if you love the period. And I'll end this video with a little bit of a plea, just in case. If you love the Crusades, if you love that period, and you have any advice for what is the way in, if it just hasn't worked its magic on me, if you've watched this channel, then you know that I am fascinated by the past, and it works its magic on me, absolutely. There are only a few periods that don't, and this is one of them. This is a subject matter, a long narrative, and that I wish inflamed love. And if you know the Crusades and love them and you have a way, some suggestions, feel free to make them in the comments, because I would love to know that. But anyway, I think we have more crusading stuff to do as the March of the Penguins waddles on. But we'll see. We'll see what we turn up tomorrow. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.